Welcome to part 2 of the art and culture of the Pacific Islands. When we left part 1, we were talking about the biche, or spirit poles, that are carved to honor the dead. And here we have another way of honoring the dead, called the Malangan ceremony, by the people of New Ireland. New Ireland is an island off the coast of eastern New Guinea. Now, these people, they honor their dead in these elaborate ceremonies for up to 2 years after someone is deceased. And a man will honor the deceased relatives of his wife's family as part of ceremonies showing his honoring of her. As part of these rituals, houses and sculptures are created, and they're unveiled at the peak moment of the ceremony, which is what we see here. These are large. The figure on the left, 6 feet tall, to give you a perspective. And from an aesthetic point of view, we see very sophisticated creation here, where we have voids and, in other words, positive and negative space, patterns that lead to a focal point, and really well-crafted items. In the past, once the ritual was done, these items would be burned as part of the release of the ritual. Now they are often sold or put in museums as artifacts. And really, they're beautiful works of art in their own right. This speaks to that notion of creating art for its own sake, or art for a ritual purpose. And really, the importance to the people, the Malangan, the people who have the Malangan ceremony, is really for the ritual. And the artwork is perhaps an afterthought or an outcome. And yet they are really quite beautiful in their own right. It's really interesting to notice how we can look at something from the outside and have our own responses to it, and yet to those people who are deeply immersed in this ritual, for example, it has a profound meaning and great value in their lives. One of the things that we see throughout most of the Pacific Islands is this formation of these male secret societies, where one goes through an initiation process and where secrets and rituals are passed down from generation to generation. What we're looking at here is from the Tolai secret society in the province of New Britain. And included in that province is something called Duke of York Island. I have to pause here and notice that Duke of York Island is a name that might represent colonial influences. I'm only saying. So this particular male society has an interesting part of their year. What they do is people gain status by showing wisdom, by gaining wealth, as we see in other similar organizations. But in this particular one, they have 3 months of intensive ceremonies each year, and it's called the Time of the Tubuan. The main purpose of these is initiation into the cult, but also people of high standing within this group put on masks and use this as a means to, you could say, touch the spirit world. And from this place, they're able to settle disputes, stop fights, punish lawbreakers, and force the payment of debts. So it's an interesting mechanism for the Tubuan masks that they play in society, because what they do is they help to keep everything in order. Now, what we're seeing here is this particular mask, which is the Tubuan, represents the female, although it is always danced by men. And you see this green leafy stuff here? Well, that has great significance. It's very important to the ritual as a whole. And they take great care in cutting the bark and painting the bark and putting it on the underneath the mask to make the actual body of the entire costume. Also interesting to note is that white feathers have a certain significance on the top, and black feathers would mean that the person wearing it had an even more prominent place within this secret cult. So there you have it. There's a mask which to our eyes might look a certain way, but has really profound meaning to the people who use it as part of their ritual practice. So now we're going to move on into Micronesia, and this area is comprised of groupings of islands composed primarily of coral. Although in the western edges of Micronesia there are some islands that are made of on top of volcanoes. As we said earlier, if an island is based on volcanic rock, then the ground is pretty fertile, and there's lots of materials for making tools and other objects. If, on the other hand, an island is primarily coral, there's really not that much there to use to make tools or implements of any kind. Also, the ground is not that fertile for growing food. What we see then in Micronesia, especially in the eastern part, is that the people became great navigators. What we're looking at here is a chart to teach navigation from an older generation to a younger generation. So as navigators, without really modern implements, what they had to do was use celestial navigation. And that meant that they became expert at reading the sun and the moon and the stars. In addition, they had to know the ocean currents and be able to catch a current and let it take them where it would. This particular chart, it's a Wapepe navigation chart, and it's really an instructional device. It's made of wood fibers tied together with banana leaves with little pieces of coconut shell to show where, well, as they approached an island, even if the island was out of sight, it would change the way that the waves were in the ocean. And these early navigators were able to sense this and to know that they were near an island, even when they couldn't yet see it. These kind of navigational devices were used actually well into the 1950s and have been used for as long as people had inhabited these islands. Let's move on over to the island of Pohnpei and take a look at an archaeological architectural wonder that's really equivalent to Stonehenge or the Great Pyramids, but much lesser known. This is Nan Madol, and on this island there's basalt cliffs, and they provided the material for one of the most remarkable structures, truly, in any part of the world, and especially of the region. Here we have 92 artificial islands set within a network of canals covering 170 acres. So this entire area, 170 acres. And it's full of this really city built into the ocean. They had these places where the canoes could come in, but they also had seawalls and breakwaters all the way around that were 35 feet thick and up to 15 feet tall. This protected the area from the ocean, from the waves beating upon the houses and the other structures, administrative structures that were housed within the walls. This was an administrative center for a series of powerful kings that ruled between the 13th and the 17th century. By the time the Europeans arrived, it had been abandoned, as the political power of these kings declined. So the stones were shaped like logs. That's how they layered these log-shaped stones and basalt boulders and made these sort of islets. And the biggest one is over 100 yards long. So think about the size of a football field. These are stones that are built, piled up on the ocean floor to create structures where people could live above ground. I like to imagine the people that are actually living there when it was at its height. It must have been phenomenal. Now we have the kings and all the people of high status, but then there's also the workers. How did they do this? One of the cornerstones that they used here was over 50 tons. Somehow that stone had to be moved. As I said, it's right up there with the pyramids. Another factoid about this that's really fascinating is how they made the log-shaped stones that they used. What they would do is they would heat the cliffs with fire, and then they would cool them with water. They would repeat this process back and forth until a piece of stone fell off. And what I keep wondering as I think about this is, how do you determine where that stone will fall? I guess once it starts to crack and go, those nearby just had to run fast or duck and cover. But really, it's a phenomenal area. It's really an incredible feat of human engineering and ingenuity. They also considered, as they built these, how they could set them up so that they could get the most benefit from the cooling prevailing winds that that were predictable within the region. Here's one of the remaining buildings, and you can see that it has gotten a little bit beat up through the years, but it's a royal mortuary compound. It stands about 25 feet tall, and here you can see a little bit of how they did the structure. It slopes delicately upward and outward, and this was done in a rather methodical fashion, determined by how they placed the stones. Within this is a small courtyard and a tomb. Now let's talk about the origins of body art. Tattooing or decorating the body was really widespread throughout the island cultures. In fact, tattoo chisels made of bone have been found in some of the earliest artifacts that we see in the Pacific Islands. So these early Polynesian tattoo artists spread the art throughout the region. And as it spread, different areas developed their own distinctive styles and designs. The Marquesas Islands, they're about 900 miles north of Tahiti, really developed the most elaborate expression of body art. Tattooing as a practice involves shedding blood, and blood is the most sacred substance in Polynesia. So these intensive tattoos, they sometimes took years to be completed. Men of high rank began the process at around age 18, and it lasted till they reached the age of, say, 30 or so. It was very expensive, and it once people of lesser rank could be tattooed in their homes, and women were often tattooed in their homes. They got tattoos around the ankles, or on the behind the ear, or sometimes on the arms, but the men were the ones that got the full body tattoos. And for these more elaborate tattoo processes, special huts were built. The tattoo artists had to be fed, they had to be paid, and after they finished each round of tattooing, there was a great feast that was held to celebrate. Each of the designs had a name and a meaning, and they marked a life transition or a social rank. They could be demonstrations of courage, honoring a courageous act, and they were also, in that society, seen as being very attractive by women. When the French colonists arrived in the 1900s, they outlawed this practice, and it pretty much died away until the 1970s, and then it came back into prominence. This is a man named Teve Tupuia, and he was the first one in modern times to get the full body art, typical of the Marquesas Islands. He had to go to Samoa to do this because the ancient practice, the specific art of traditional tattooing, had all but died out, and there was just a few people who were still doing it. So he found an artist in Samoa to do the designs. It took 6 weeks and cost him about $30,000, but he based his designs on some drawings that a German naturalist had made of the people of his day. So he was able to really replicate the traditional designs that had all but gone away. The island of New Zealand, which is south of Australia and further from the equator, has a much more temperate climate. And when it was settled, which was really relatively late, in the year 800 by adventurous Polynesians, they sailed to New Zealand and settled it. But what they found there was a climate that had more seasons and more cold than they were used to. So as a result, they adapted to build these wooden structures. I found them remarkably similar to the longhouses of the Northwest native people of the American continent. In this area of New Zealand, The houses were built to honor the ancestors, and the ridgepole was supposed to represent the spine, whereas the rafters were the ribs. They were elaborately decorated. Some parts were done by the women, who actually weren't allowed to come inside the ceremonial houses, and so they decorated them from the outside, and some parts were done by the men. These figures at the middle, they represent the ancestors who support the governance and the structure, who support right attitudes and making the proper decisions in their belief system. When Captain Cook arrived on New Zealand, he found different styles of these houses built throughout the country, throughout the island and its small islands around it, each of them representing a different style of art. Here we have different components. Here's an interior side wall, and these sculptures have specific meaning. The interior rear wall and the front. And these elements that are coming down here on the front are supposed to represent the arms that would wrap around a person that would inside this building. What we're looking at here is a feathered cloak from the Hawaiian Islands. For much of its history, the people of the Hawaiian Islands were gathered in small enclaves with chiefs at the center of each. It wasn't until after the Europeans made the first contact that they were united under King Kamehameha I in 1810. These feathered cloaks were very important, and they were said to transmit mana or energy to the person who wore them. They were woven by special sort of sanctified artisans, and on each cloak thousands of feathers would be used. The feathers were tied in bundles onto kind of a coconut fiber netting. So maybe thousands of feathers on one bird, thousands of feathers on one cloak, and 7 or 8 feathers off of each of the birds. So these were very special indeed. This particular coat was given to a Commodore, an Englishman, when he visited the Hawaiian Islands. And so we have it now to see this great artistry. But at the time that they were made, they were really only worn by those most elite members of Hawaiian society. Here we have some of the most monumental sculpture throughout the Pacific Islands. And this is on the island of Rapa Nui, also known as Easter Island. This is the most isolated island of all of the ones that we've been looking at. It's 2,300 miles off of South America, although it is now a part of Chile. There's 3 volcanoes, one in each corner, that make up this small island. The Polynesians arrived here between 800 and 1200 AD, and they built these sculptures. They built so many, nearly 1,000 have been found, including 400 that were left unfinished in a quarry. Now these that we're looking at, they're probably around 36 feet tall. They found them up to 65 feet tall, unfinished. They were moved up to 11 miles to be put in place on these altars, which begs the question, how did they do that? Well, the current theory is that they would attach ropes to them and sort of rock them side to side as they moved them along. There have been fragments of smashed sculptures found along the way that lend credence to this theory and suggest that all the sculptures didn't make it. The eyes that we see have been painted back in. These were restored in 1978, and some of them placed back in their original placements. Many of them appear to be looking out to sea. They're mysterious, and yet they appear to be part of an established Polynesian spiritual tradition that was expressed here on Rapa Nui. I wonder about those people traveling in the canoes so far to find this teeny little island and to decide to settle there. That's very mysterious to me, and the artwork is really quite beautiful in its own haunting way. When the first European settlers or adventurers arrived there, there was about 3,000 people living on Rapa Nui. Then we had some slave traders that passed through and left smallpox behind them. So it went from 3,000 down to as low as 110, as they were really decimated by a disease which the people had no defenses for. Now there's about 5,000 people living on Easter Island, and they've developed a distinctive dance form that they often perform for the tourists that come through. There's a fiber called bark cloth or tapa that was used throughout Polynesia. And in this case, it's made by beating the bark with a mallet until it gets flat and soft, and then folding it over and beating again until it becomes a very soft and pliable cloth. A variety of different kinds of bark were used for this, and then the process had a lot of variations to create patterns. Sometimes the cloth would be placed over a textured surface, so it would be incised and the pattern would come through. Often, dyes were used to create these patterns like we see here. Now, this bark cloth had a variety of uses, from floor mats to ceremonial wrappings to robes that the chiefs would wear. This particular one is from Samoa and is probably a cape or a wrap for a chief. So as we wrap up this discussion of the arts and culture of the Pacific Islands, let's bring it to today. In the 1970s, there was a festival of the Pacific Arts that started, that travels to various islands and showcases the art and music of the many diverse societies that live there. And now this has been going on for well over 30 years, and it's blossomed, and each of the separate islands and different countries now have their own festivals, and then they meet in the one large regional festival every year. This has done so much to support the art and culture of the region, and now there's a real resurgence in the traditional ways that date back from way before colonialism. So in a way, it's come full circle. These peoples have had great struggles, and yet they've emerged with their art and their culture intact. So this concludes the audio lecture on the art and culture of the Polynesian Islands. Thanks for listening.